All right, hi folks. I'm fresh off the highway from Coleman this morning. That's about 3 hours south of here, right? I rarely make it to this region. So really glad to be here with you all today, especially because I know this is a collection of like-minded people who are invested in the same things collaboratively. So really honored to moderate this panel today. I'll kick things off with our question and then hand off the microphone to our panelists. And we'll welcome a few questions at the end, should we have time. All right, so historic preservation advocacy has changed over the years. We know this. Methods for engagement, promotion, fundraising, lobbying have evolved, accommodating those generational shifts, perspectives on giving, and the power of social media and politics. What are some of the most profound changes from your perspective? And what does it mean for the future of advocacy in this field?
Well, as I've talked about several times, I've been in this a long time. And it's been interesting to watch as each generation comes up, their take on historic preservation. Because I know that, back in the day, we tended to be, I think, in my opinion, a little more rigid about things. And being accused of wanting to preserve things in amber, about not telling the whole story. You go to the museum house and you hear about what was happening during the mid-19th century in the South, or just what was happening. That wasn't part of the conversation. But now preservation is more about telling the whole story, that everyone is important, everyone's history is important. And I wouldn't be in preservation if it were an elitist thing that it was perceived to be when I first started. So I think that has changed how we perceive it. It's not just mansions and where presidents slept. It's shotgun houses on up. And that has really broadened the landscape. And then just the change of communication. I have a millennial, Gen Z, and they keep me up to speak on things. But the communication strategies with them are very different. They have very different attention span. Different things catch their eye and engage. And so I think that is what's changing. Now, more young people involved. Millennials love historic preservation and downtowns and historic neighborhoods, and so it's really brought new energy.
And I totally agree. I have a feeling that will probably be a constant refrain. So as someone who, I never really thought about myself as a preservationist. So the doctor and Dr. Coleman, I'm an academic historian. And so I approach the past through archives, through documents, through stories. And so my role, my baptism into preservation sort of came from that standpoint, looking at these buildings as ways to tell really profound and impactful stories. And I think what has been amazing about the change in preservation, and I get to see it a little bit in my organization, we're super old for a preservation nonprofit. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. And so there's a whole lot of pressure to keep that going. But it has been wonderful, and I think so important to see the transformation of preservation is really about people. It's not about buildings, right? The buildings are in service to the people, right? If the people weren't here, the buildings wouldn't matter. And so as you talked about moving away from that rigidity, some would say maybe some, as someone on my board, great historic preservation professor says, that great fetishism, right? This is the stuff that matters. And talking about preservation, not only about as saving buildings, but saving those buildings are in service to engaging communities. And that's what we've got to focus on. And while I come at it through a historian and somewhat of a design style, I'll be honest with you, right? I just love a beautiful building. But as a historian, as someone who's attracted right to the beauty, to the architecture of a lot of these structures, what I would love to see is the many paths now that people can make it to preservation. They may not care a whit about who lived there in the past. They may not care a bit about who designed this building, but what they might care about is the impact right now that building is having on their community or on their neighborhood. That might be what they care about. What they might care about is the environmental cost, right? This neighborhood is getting ready to be wholesale demolished. You know, all that stuff landing in a landfill. They're worried about the environmental consequences of it. They see the potential for racial, social, class justice that preservation can bring. And so it creates a big tent. And that's really lovely. In fact, a good example, last May, we had a wonderful event wrapping up a project that the Bluegrass Trust had been involved in for about 8 years or so. The pandemic slowed it down a bit. But it was historic Palmer Pharmacy. Wonderful mid-century modern building built by Dr. Roosevelt Palmer, who is an Appalachian folk like me, and the first black person in the nation that owned a Rexall pharmacy. And so he had 2 of these pharmacies in Lexington. One was in Georgetown. It was bombed by the Klan with him in it. Luckily, he and his family survived. And then he built the Palmer Pharmacy in the east end of Lexington, a historically black neighborhood. That building had ended up in city hands. They had rearranged their social services. There was no longer a need for this building, and it was threatened with demolition. And so luckily, the Bluegrass Trust was able to stay that demolition. We formed Palmer Pharmacy Consortium, and eventually we were able to work with community leaders to find a new owner for that building, and it was the United Way of Bluegrass. Now, the United Way of Bluegrass, not a preservation nonprofit, right? Their focus totally different. Social services, you know, they're trying to get people to meet their basic needs. They want to help people find good employment, and they want to make sure that folks have access to education. So working with them as an ally had its challenges, for sure, but its strengths saved that building. So we were able at the Bluegrass Trust, in fact, I'd like to give a shout out to Brittany Sims there, who's on our staff, helped us write a $50,000 planning grant on the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, thanks to National Trust, which we were able to double with some private donations to $100,000, but we needed $1.2 million to save this building. So we were a little off. But in comes the United Way. They wanted a presence in this community, in the east end of Lexington. And so working with United Way, they were able, thanks to some city funding, but mostly through their contacts with private family foundations, we were able to raise that $1.2 million, to the point when Brent came back and was like, hey, y'all need more funding? There might be some more coming up. I was able to say, it's actually funded. That does not happen very often in the preservation movement. And that was mostly thanks to the family foundation, the leader of which, of that family, does not like preservation. In fact, is emphatic that he is not a preservationist. He thinks it's old, he thinks it's stuffy, but what he loves is the social services that the United Way provides. And so we got this person to donate $800,000 to a preservation project who doesn't like preservation. And so this building, allyships and partnerships, you know, as I said, Bluegrass Trust has no enemies, right? We only have co-conspirators, allies, and potential allies. And it really helps. So it's an exciting time. It's a scary time in many ways, but it's a really exciting time to be in preservation.
I don't know that I can say anything better than that. I mean, well, no, I mean, what a fabulous story to talk about how something got fully funded in a kind of a surprising way. And what I was the way I was gonna answer this question has really been underpinned by both of your comments about how preservation advocacy has changed because we're working in a lot of different coalitions that maybe don't present themselves as obvious choices right off the bat, right? So one of those advocacy tenets or ways to advocate that I talked about earlier was relationship and coalition building. And I mean, I'm in regular meetings with folks in the humanities. Okay, that makes sense, right? Humanities and preservation, those go hand in hand. I'm in regular coalition meetings with climate activists. I'm in regular coalition meetings with architects. Okay, that makes sense. I'm in regular coalition meetings with small business developers. So like lots of ways that preservation is supported in outside of traditional preservation means, I think has really changed the way that we do preservation. One example I like to talk about is some advocacy work that I did with AIA, and we kind of came together to talk to a caucus on Capitol Hill. Caucuses and committees are different. Caucuses you can just be in if it's a topic that you're interested in. There's a bourbon caucus, there's all kinds of caucuses. But there is on Capitol Hill a conservative climate caucus, which many people find surprising that such a caucus exists, but it's full of there are dozens of Republican members of Congress in this conservative climate caucus, and they are thinking about solutions to climate issues to be creative. And so we were like, we're a creative solution. The greenest building is the one that's already built, so let's talk about that and not demolition. So building relationships kind of outside of traditional means, I think is a huge way that advocacy for preservation has changed in the past at least decade, but a couple decades for sure.
I'm going to attempt to speak loud enough. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. We'll save some time that way. Okay, so this question is personally interesting to me, and we'll touch on it a little bit. We're trying to reach the next generation of preservation advocates, and many of us are in the room. What trends are you seeing, and what seems to resonate with those younger audiences from your perspective?
Well, I've been heartened to see young people, like I talked about earlier, just really diving in to our field. And a lot of them are coming because they're coming back to cities and historic neighborhoods. And that's their gateway drug to preservation. They find a little bungalow in a house, in a neighborhood that they can afford and that they want to fix up. And it's for them, it may not be about the history, it's about the community and where they're living and, who their neighbors are and how they want to be in the world. We've had, a lot of groups across the country started doing programming specifically for young people to get them in. I know the Georgia Trust. What's the group about?
Inherit Georgia.
Inherit Georgia. People do young professional groups, do meetups, preservation and libations, just trying to cultivate those young people. And I think that young people now seem to be more activist than they were. They seem to be more engaged in what's going on in the world around them than what I was when I was in college and early life and wasn't paying much attention to what was going on around me. But they seem more poised to engage if you give them a vehicle to do that. If you can speak in their language through their communications channels about issues they care about, and you might be framing that issue differently than we used to. It's a beautiful historic house designed by so-and-so, but hey, this is part of the fabric of our community and this story matters. They seem to be more engaged than maybe Gen X was.
And certainly, riffing off of that, some of the things that we have talked about internally at our organization, especially when it comes to engaging younger audiences, is opening up our idea of what advocacy looks like, and what especially leadership looks like. This is something, a constant thing. You see it at all nonprofit boards. We want younger people on our board. Right? How do we get young people on our board? You probably won't, to be honest with you. That's really tough. But that's not a bad thing. What you need to be doing, and that's the worst phrase, right, human language, what you should do, something I would encourage you to do is construct easier avenues to that leadership, right? Make sure that mentoring, make sure that engagement is happening now. So, with the Bluegrass Trust, a lot of that happens through our committees. I can't get a lot of folks, who are my age or so, kids at home, right, early in their careers or mid-careers, the kind of dedication and sometimes financial resources that it takes to be at the board level. I mean, it's just not there yet. But what I can do, right, is engage them at the committee level, and we are preparing them for that leadership role, for them to take it. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. And engaging in what resonates, I think, folks, with younger audiences. One committee in particular, if you were doing an estimated age medium, my youngest committee is probably my Detours committee. So Detours is a monthly free event, 6 o'clock on Wednesdays, so sort of right after work. It's actually geared towards young professionals, although the audience is really mixed. But the committee is almost all young professionals. And what gets them interested in that is the fact that we go into places that folks never think about as being preservation sites, right? They're not for historic house museums, right? A lot of times they're not sites that are typically open to the public. So, for example, in April, we got access to Happy Chandler's cabin, where when he was commissioner of baseball, that's where they made the decision to desegregate baseball. Great crowd for that. In June, it's Pride Month, so we're working with an LGBTQ history nonprofit to do a walking tour of historic LGBTQ sites in Lexington. And so that gets, it's not your typical or your stereotypical idea of what historic preservation looks like. So.
And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that young people are also elected officials. So you've got to be 25 years old to run for Congress. You have to be 30 years old to run for the Senate. Ages are similar at the state level. So, and you can be even younger to be on school boards or to be on town councils or to kind of have an elected role, but maybe it's a volunteer role or it's a part-time role, those kinds of things. So think too about in your communities, there are young folks who are really engaged and interested, and they may not be preservationists, but they may be sitting on your school board, and they may be interested in maybe running for office or doing something part-time like that. Like, engage those young people early, because if they're interested in doing an unpaid elected position when they're 26 years old, probably they're going to want to stay in office or grow in office or continue to serve their community in some kind of way. You don't sign up to run for an election if you don't care about investing in your community. And so these young people really are doing this in droves. And I actually spoke recently, there's a young elected officials network of young folks kind of like in all walks of their elected official life. And I spoke to them about historic preservation and how it can be a solution for a lot of things, like housing, like climate solutions, like investing in downtowns and small businesses. Like, these are solutions that they were not aware of, and it's almost like I got them real early in their careers. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make you a preservationist in a way that you didn't think that you were gonna be, and maybe you're gonna continue to use these solutions if you grow in office, or even if you leave elected office and you're gonna continue to invest in your community in another way. Now you're kind of thinking about historic preservation as a means for a solution for these kinds of pressing issues that we're thinking about. And maybe it is housing that made them really want to run for office because nobody can afford rent, and they said, well, I want to change that. Okay, well, let's talk about how preservation can be a solution for this thing that you're really interested in.
I'll also also add, if you're in a college town, you are ripe with potential. In Bowling Green, we're home to Western Kentucky University. If you're from the area, you might have seen that we're currently causing some good trouble over some efforts that the university administration is taking on with some very historic buildings on campus. This has ignited interest from the college students, right? And so we're creating these conversations about what historic preservation is, what that push and pull of progress and preservation is, and how we can bring that history with us instead of eliminating it. So to that point, too, we all know that there is that tension, right, between keeping things what they have been and also growing, changing, coming into today's world and creating spaces that people want to live in, work in, plan, and invest in, which is complicated. So, talk to us about ways we can avoid becoming a victim of our own success and inviting that attention, that discourse in these spaces.
I talked about this earlier, we're the dog that caught the car. And now we have a whole new set of challenges to deal with demand for the spaces that we're trying to protect. And I've learned that it's just human nature that we tend to eat the goose that laid the golden egg. And I see it in cities over and over again where the preservationists and the pioneers come in early. They fix up the neighborhood commercial district, people fix up houses, they start small businesses, there's festivals, and you create this wonderful, livable, attractive, successful place by the grassroots. They pulled it together. And it's inevitable that once a place is successful, people who weren't a part of that initial work are going to come in to capitalize on it. I've seen it in Portland, beautiful neighborhoods, they revitalize them, and then the second and third wave of developers come in. They don't have the history, how it came to be this beautiful place. They're just gonna, strip mine it to bring in, the funding, the profits that they want. And so that's why it's really important, number one, to get the protections in place in those early days. We did that with our historic Market Square downtown. We couldn't get a local district over the whole downtown, but we protected Market Square, which is the heart and soul of Knoxville. Or else, we really had people who wanted to come and put like a, what's his name, Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome on top of one of the buildings. We had developers who wanted to actually enclose the square like an indoor mall in a glass enclosure. I mean, they have no connections to how it became attractive to people in the first place. It's like, great, you're taking every option that will kill the reason it's successful. So get those protections in early and, make sure your local government is on board because they can't turn you away a waving dollar. Help them understand why this method of economic development is a very sustainable, predictable, resident-oriented thing. Because if you're successful, they will come and they will introduce.
And out of all the questions that we discussed earlier, I was like, oh, I hope they don't ask this one. Because the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. It's something that we have talked about, quite a bit internally at the Bluegrass Trust. This sort of generational shift, where people are wanting to live, where people are wanting to invest. We've explored the problem quite a bit. We have a biannual magazine called Preservation Matters. And 3 issues ago, we dedicated it specifically to preservation and gentrification. And so the issues, if you know much about Lexington, you know that we're in a housing crisis. We have an urban service boundary that constricts development downtown because we have wonderful historic horse farms that we want to protect too. Another one of our golden gooses, right, we don't want to eat. And so with the investment that's going in downtown, we're starting to see, and this is what really makes me angry, we have some folks who are developers who are not thinking about long-term thoughtful development. A lot of times they will co-opt the language of preservation. They'll slap some paint on a building, and this is a cultural good. Now we're absolutely decimating the historic community that has lived here for generations. All of those ties, all of those connections, right, for neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly poor, historically Black, and historically underserved. And so it's a big issue. And so how do we as preservationists make sure that the gospel that we're preaching is not being used to actually harm the communities that are so central to the work we want to do? And I don't know the answer to that. That Preservation Matters, we ask folks from all over central Kentucky to give their viewpoints, to give their ideas. But it's a tough one. And I'd love to have the chance to discuss it with you sometime.
Another thing on this topic that I'm a little bit curious about is the push and pull between revenue generating historic spaces and residential or historically residential historic spaces. What have your organizations done to engage in that conversation about, for example, should this historic building that might otherwise be demolished become that short-term rental in order to fund its salvage?
Yeah, that's a tough topic because bottom line, you gotta pay for it. And if you don't, you're gonna lose it. And I always say preservationists, we look 100 years ahead. These folks you talk about like 10 years ahead, or they flip it to the owner after 4 years, that kind of stuff. You really have to look ahead because we're about making that building last. And whatever I need to do to keep it alive so it can have another life later on, sometimes it's not the best choice that you want to have, but I always thought, will it save the building? So we had a row of townhouses in Knoxville. We have very few left of this type, and owned by absentee slumlords. I mean, it was a disaster, crime, squatters, the whole 9 yards. And, the neighborhood, this historic neighborhood, they're like, we're just gonna tear it down, because they blame the buildings for the stuff the humans are doing. And they assume that if they just knock down the building, the problem will go away. I just, well, no, that's not, they come let's handle what they can want. That's not gonna solve your problem, and we're gonna lose a really great row of buildings. And so in that case, the best use became permanent supportive housing for the homeless. And we partnered with a nonprofit there. Ideally, people would like to have seen it, residential, traditional homeowner, middle class, or whatever in these buildings. But that wasn't going to happen because it was right next to all the homeless district. And so we partnered with that nonprofit and Volunteer Ministry Center and put together a deal. They use the historic tax credits, the market tax credits, the live tax credits. We put together like an 8-piece capital stack. And it's now permanent supportive housing for the homeless. But if you look, they have been in a facility downtown. And as downtown redeveloped, the nonprofit sold their building downtown and made a bunch of money on it because downtown was redeveloping. And then they went out to this spot. Now they've done those buildings and they're taking great care of them. At some point, they're going to sell those and they'll probably go back into the residential homeowner market. So think 100 years out and do whatever's required to save the building.
I think too, Main Street has an amazing answer to this using community development block grants, CDBG. So being able to, think about your Main Street, like the bottom floor is that small business, and then there's, the second, maybe the third story that can be used for, rental lofts or something like that. And so the way that that's able to be done is through this federal program, CDBG. And so supporting that, making sure that that's robustly funded is really important for instances like this. That doesn't necessarily talk to these like individual townhomes or something like that, residential district, but like using this space on a main street to accomplish the goal of like having a revenue generator on the first floor and then, rental or owner, loss above, is a fabulous solution to that. And again, that, like to our earlier question, that's just bringing more people into the fold of becoming preservationists.
And we're talking a lot about collaboration, right? United we stand, divided we fall. That unites all of us. Can you all share some actionable best practices for really effective collaboration that you've seen, whether that's between local, regional, and state, or federal, national levels, or if that is even nonprofit and governmental organizations?
I'm going to pass this off, but can I just first say, Kentucky has a fantastic state motto. United we stand, divided we fall. That's very cool. Being a Tennessean, our state motto is agriculture and commerce, and that's way more boring. So you have a fabulous state motto. That's very cool.
I talked about this the other day, so.
I guess best practices. So I'm from Eastern Kentucky originally, so I have like a million little clips and things that I like to pull out. And one of them is, don't plant an acorn today and expect to sit under its shade tomorrow. And when it comes to partnerships, start them early and tend them. As you were talking about, Kim, it's hard to do that in the middle of a crisis, right? It's hard to get people up to speed. It's hard to get people educated. It's hard to get people to care when it's in a crisis sometimes. Sometimes it'll happen, when they see that wrecking ball going through that building, the emotions will well up. But when you're trying to avoid that point, a year ahead of time, that's hard. So start early. That would be, I think that is probably my central piece of advice. And look for, like I mentioned with Palmer Pharmacy, the family foundation had notoriously anti-preservation, the dad who started it did not like preservation. Look for unlikely allies, or folks who can bring in those allies. In the case of Palmer Pharmacy, it's United Way that could sit down with him. He never would have taken a meeting with me. And so that can be powerful. And that creativity is something that preservationists, I think, have in spades. The need often leads to creativity. And I think it's becoming a much more open and imaginative field, something we actually just announced this last week. So we have a wonderful property called Latrobe's Villa, 1811 building. Patrick is certainly the scholar. Designed by Benjamin Latrobe, considered by many folks to be the best surviving example of his residential architecture. And we've had this building for 37 years. Long time to have it. It suffered a terrible fire, slated for demolition. The Bluegrass Trust comes in. We have, one is basically a ruin. It's amazing. Y'all should come and see it sometime. But what are we going to do with it? In 87, when the Bluegrass Trust sort of took that leap of faith to purchase it, that was, you were still within that generation of the historic house museum, right? Tourism dollars could support this, but still, we weren't able to make that work. We were able to get the envelope pretty much secured, but the inside completely unfinished. But we were able to use that time as a preservation learning lab. In fact, if you've been in the Historic House Museum, you've probably seen a recreated wallpaper that came out of Pope Villa, or a study of Pope Villa's wallpapers. All kinds of wonderful things came from it. But it was, our temporary roof is getting ready to be 40 years old. We have walls that are getting really shoddy and like they move a little too much. What are we going to do? And so we did a request for expressions of interest. We had to find a partner who has the financial resources to carry out the rehabilitation and who had a feasible end use. As Craig always says, this is a phrase that I use a lot. The building has to have a job if it's going to survive. And so it was fascinating, the responses that we got to that request for expressions of interest. There were people who maybe didn't want to give the Bluegrass Trust $3.4 million to restore that building. I can understand that. But if it was their own investment, they were willing to take that. And we ended up working with preservation-focused development firm. In fact, the lead is speaking here tomorrow. And last week we announced a $3.4 million development deal for Glorilla. And it's a lot because of that private investment. And so when it's rehabilitated, the secondary rooms of that building are going to be lot use, high-end boutique office space. But the primary rooms, and they're amazing. There's a rotunda, there's 2 facility shake rooms, crazy house, amazing structure. Those will be shared by the tenants, but they'll also be open to the public. So the educational opportunities, the opportunities to experience that building, we were able to preserve that too through this partnership. So unlikely allies, right? Something that probably would not have cut the mustard in the sun, right, when this building first came into our hands. So imagination. Sorry.
You know, on working together in advocacy and partnerships, something that's been on my mind lately, we are facing some real challenges coming from the federal level. You know, all of the funding being cut, staffing being cut, basically our whole web of infrastructure from the federal to the state to the local level is in real peril right now. And as you would expect, in times of danger, sometimes humans turn on each other, the circular firing squad. So instead of circling the wagons, we have a circular firing squad. Well, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. And we had this big debate over the last 3 months with some folks like really turning on each other and judging each other on who was saying what when. And we are small. Our movement is very small in the scheme of things. I mean, we have like 3 degrees of separation of all the professionals in this movement nationally. And so what my message is, you know, in times of crisis, we need to work together, blame each other. Everyone has their own way of responding to this, and we should be kind and remember that each group has its own constituency, its own agenda, and the way it should be talking, but we should always be united because your state motto is so correct, especially in our world where there's not a lot of us. So that I think is coming together now. I just think everybody got knocked sideways. I didn't know what to do, and so people were panicking, and there were Facebook groups that were just blowing up their plane. And it's like, this only helps the people who are against what we want to do. So we have to stick together and circle the wagons when issues like this come up. But everybody has their role to play. I know when I did advocacy work in Knoxville, I loved the crazy people screaming at the gate. I mean, they were awesome. I couldn't be that person because I was running the preservation group, but you know, they were riled up and raising Cain about issues, which made me look very reasonable. So I could get a meeting and go, I can save you from those crazy people. Let's cut a deal. So everybody has their role to play. If you want to run Molotov cocktails about literally, you know, do your thing. But understand that other organizations have other roles, and that if we all work in tandem, then we can be successful rather than attacking each other.
So we're now on borrowed time. I'm going to ask one last question to maybe synthesize a few and just invite last things you want to make sure to squeeze in. And I'll speak from a bit of my own history in this guild. So I moved into a Polk Victorian circa 1836 It wasn't until we were nominated for an award granted by the Landmark Trust that I learned the stories of its history, because our chair had done the research and had this really compelling narrative. And that story was what made me say, how do I get involved? How do I get into the city planning commission? So talk to us about how we can use heritage, we can use stories from these spaces to leverage, to advocate, to recruit, or maybe to even plant seeds in some of the spaces of Kentucky that don't have the support that our larger cities do.
I love what you said earlier about stories. That is our most powerful weapon. Without stories, it's a pile of bricks. Unless you really care about architecture, which I love. Modern, ancient, I love it all. Most people don't. So the stories are the connection that bring people in. Our motto in Oscar used to be, we preserve history you can touch. You can walk up to the place where these things happen, that they embody history. But the stories are so important. I'm very lucky that my boyfriend is a writer and a historian. And back in the day when downtown Knoxville was deserted, he was writing for a local weekly paper called Metro Pulse. And his thing was like, all American history passes through Knoxville in some way or another. And he just started telling the stories of Knoxville and downtown Knoxville and specific buildings and specific characters. And boy, do we have some characters. Kid Curry's last seen crossing Gay Street Bridge in downtown Knoxville, never be seen again. You know, all this history that had disappeared. And his column was called Secret History. And I credit him with a big part of revitalizing downtown Knoxville because he told those stories, and rather than people seeing it as this outdated, run-down, crime-infested area of Knoxville that nobody wanted to go to, suddenly it became really interesting. And I think those stories changed everything, because then people became interested in it, people started buying buildings, people who were reading those stories got involved in development, and really, you've got to communicate those stories and make that connection between your community and the people that live there, because they've forgotten, and you need to reframe what those communities can be based on what they've done in the past. People love stories. I'm very lucky because I get to hear stories every night.
Yeah. So earlier in my session, I mentioned how important it is to be both likable and credible. So credible is having that great data, but the likable part is the stories. You're going to be more winsome with folks if you're drawing them in and talking about, what was happening on Gay Street, 1940, or last night, as we were kind of walking down, what's that main road? Monument? That's the road. As we were walking down that, and I saw these banners on the light poles of veterans from Newport, and I was really just, that's a fabulous way to tell a real quick story, because, somebody might see that banner and say, oh, that's so nice that they're honoring veterans from the past. But you also can walk through this, walk down the street and think, oh my gosh, I bet he walked down the street too before he showed off, or whatever it was. Like that quick storytelling, brings people into these spaces in a different way. I love a house museum. I am big into 18th century furniture, so I will be the one that's not with the guy at the museum because I'm in the room calling him with furniture. But if we're not telling these stories about these places that are important, then it does just become, a pile of bricks and we're gonna get left behind. So I think bringing it back, it's not just about advocating with your elected officials, but being likable and credible, talking to, this developer, or talking to United Way. You have to tell these stories about why it's important. And so it is not just about tax revenue, like how boring is that? There has to be support for that and draw people in with these incredible stories.
Right, and it's those stories that I think inherently get people invested, going back to the Palmer Pharmacy, right? That could have been leveled, big, beautiful new building, right, providing the same great services to this historically underserved neighborhood. But Palmer Pharmacy can offer something, and our historic buildings can offer something that nothing else can, right? When you're going to the Wayfinding Center for the United Way, you're probably not in the middle of your best day, right? You're probably, there are some things that are wrong, right? But you're walking into that space and you're seeing the timeline of Dr. Earl Palmer, right? He was the civil rights activist who literally get calls in his search for justice within this world. Him and his entire family was almost assassinated. But yet he pursued, right? He became the first member of the Board of Trustees of the University of Kentucky. So when you're walking into that space, right, you're walking into a story of, you're not the first one, you won't be the last one, and you're not alone, right? We all stand on the shoulders of giants. And our buildings can convey that in unique and special ways that simply can't be replicated.
And just as a few closing remarks, I think that Palmer Pharmacy anecdote is such a great metaphor. It's such a great takeaway for all of us. I was not aware of the building. I've jotted down some notes, and I suspect many people in the room have, just because we now know it's there, just because we now know its story and want to see it, experience it, feel it, and touch it. So before I hand off for a few logistics of the transition, I just want to say thanks to our panelists for your thoughtful remarks.